pride at work and pride in one's company. This is all born out of the conversations that all of us have regarding the challenges that HR professionals face. And coming out of the pandemic, we heard one thing. If we heard 100 things, it was always the same thing. It came down to the whole idea of being able to hire more people, the difficulty in hiring, getting people to return to the workforce. Well, 2 years after the pandemic has, I think, officially ended, we're still hearing people talk about the challenge in hiring and retaining top talent, eliminating that unwanted turnover. And one of the things that the data from this study tells us is that, people do really seem increasingly less loyal to companies than they have been in the past. We ask a question, if I were offered significantly more money, I would choose to stay at my present company. We saw the level of agreement to that question plummet from 2021 to 2023. So hiring and turnover are still major issues that we're wrestling with. We've also got, because I think in some cases, lower than desired staffing levels, we're certainly seeing more employee frustration. We hear people talk about this openly when we're customers and we're talking to someone about our frustration about being on the phone or having to wait too long or just getting bad service in general. We hear employees always saying, well, we're just short-staffed, or, we don't have what we need to get the job done right. And then that ultimately results in something that all of us are familiar with, terrible customer experience. One of the things that we saw in the 2000s, the early part of the 21st century, is we saw a real focus on customer centricity, where it was almost like an arms race where everybody was trying to compete on the basis of providing better and better customer experiences. Well, now if you're a customer of any business or any service, or you've called a call center, or you've waited in line to be waited on somewhere, we all recognize that customer service is really, really plummeted. And here's the evidence when we look at the American Customer Satisfaction Index from 1994 to 2022. You can see that the last number that we have here, 2022, we pretty much have lost 20 years of gains that we've made in customer satisfaction and customer experience. On top of that, when you think about the millions, if not billions of dollars that have been spent over the last several decades trying to improve employee engagement, employee motivation, and we still continue to hear about things like the term quiet quitting and the great resignation, all the terms that we've heard for the last couple of years. One of the things that my friends said, my former colleagues at Gallup, I just pulled this off of their website. When you look at that green line of U.S. Active employee engagement, the percentage of actively engaged employees, the last metric that's reported on the website, 32%. So 1/3 of American workers are actively engaged. And look all the way back to the year 2000. That is a pretty flat line when you consider all the money that we've spent in measuring, incenting, trying to motivate people. It's a flat line. In fact, just for fun, I last 20 years, the percentage of actively engaged, and guess what that number came out to? You got it, 32%. So we basically have gone up and down a few percentage points from the average percentage in 2022 of actively engaged employees, but we've really never gotten above what we would call 1/3 of the U.S. Workforce actively engaged. Now, we have seen the blue line shows that companies that work with Gallup, the best practice organizations, there has been some progress within pockets of the world in terms of best practice organizations improving their level of engagement. But for the most part, all the money that we spent, either it hasn't worked or it hasn't been sustainable. And so the question is, after all of this, what's the solution? We've been really now at this for the last several decades, And when we really look at it, understanding that the needle hasn't moved as much as we would expect it to, given the fact that we've put so much focus on employee engagement and employee motivation and trying to stimulate employee performance, because we understand that we now represent the US economy, and in fact, the global economy is really very service driven, that it's no longer a manufacturing driven world where people own the machines and the factories, that now the intellectual capital that people bring into their companies, that represents the value that the company creates. A company's value is represented in the people that work for it. So what's the solution? Well, as Michael mentioned, we really have focused the last number of years. Michael and his colleagues have focused on this whole notion of pride in the workplace, pride in one's company, and pride in one's work. And we believe that this is an often underlooked, underappreciated component of employee engagement. And the reason we feel it's so critical is because when you think about it, pride is really an emotional driver. It's not how we think, it's how we feel. And we know from neuroscience research that we're all emotionally driven people, that we don't make our decisions rationally, we do them emotionally. We make those decisions emotionally. So this is the component that we really are trying to understand, because we believe that if you can understand how people feel, and specifically the pride that people feel in the work that they perform in their company, we believe that this is the unheralded driver of engagement. That's the secret sauce that's been missing up to this point. So as Michael mentioned, this is the second time that we've done this study. We did the first study in 2021, really in the height of the pandemic. The pandemic was still pretty much full force affecting the world as we know it. People largely had not gone back to work yet, but we studied 1,000 employees both in 2023, late in the year, and 2021. And that's a solid sample size for studying national populations. If you look at national political polls, it's typically based on 1,000. So there's a very small margin of error in the percentages that we report. These are all people who are employed full-time, 35 hours or more a week, not contract workers or self-employed, all 18 years or older. And we got all these people through an independent online panel provider, vetted all these people for their qualifications to answer questions about their workplace and about the work they perform. So as I mentioned, we really focused on two types of pride: the individual pride that people experience about their work, and company pride, how they feel about their company. So when you define those concepts, individual pride is defined as having pride in one's work, which is a deeply personal and intrinsic feeling of satisfaction, fulfillment, and ownership derived from the quality, effort, and impact of one's contribution. Company pride refers to the emotional connection and sense of satisfaction that employees feel toward the company they work for. It encompasses a deep-seated belief in the company's mission, values, products, services, and overall reputation. Now, it's worth mentioning that there's a correlation between these two. They're not completely independent or uncorrelated, but you can clearly have situations where one type of pride exists and the other does not. For example, I frequently hear conversations from the healthcare sector. Recently went in for a test scan in my local hospital, talking to the people who work there who are conducting my stress test, asking them how they liked working for the new management. And they talked about how much they love the field of healthcare, but they do not love the business of healthcare. And you can oftentimes see people love the work that they do, but they don't necessarily love the company for whom they perform that work. We often see this in educators who are very proud of the work that they perform, not so proud of the school district, perhaps, for whom they work. At the same time, we can see people who are very proud of the company they work for, believe that they work for a company with a great reputation that's recognized as an ethical, honest company. but don't necessarily feel that they're doing the meaningful work that they'd like to be doing and getting as much out of it as they would like to, both on a personal and professional level. So we can have these two operating separately. And this is one of the things that I want to focus on as we walk through the results of the study. So, individual work pride. We put people in three groups. We had people respond to the question, I'm extremely proud of the work that I perform. If you strongly agreed with that statement, you were in the high pride group. If you agreed, but didn't strongly agree, you were in the moderate work pride group. And if you were either neutral or disagreed, you were in the low work pride group. So look at the relationship on this chart between the relationship between high work pride and these other important HR outcomes. So job satisfaction, how people respond to the question, I'm completely satisfied with my job. 53% of people who have high pride in their work strongly agree that they're completely satisfied with their work. Now, compare that to people only show moderate work pride or low work pride. You'll also notice that moderate work pride, the people who will check an agree box on a survey, are much, much closer to the people who disagree than they are to the people that strongly agree. And just as an aside, this is why you should never combine strongly agrees and agrees on any kind of employee survey, because in doing so, you're combining two groups of people that look very, very different from each other. When we look at the question, how people respond to, I would strongly recommend my company's products and services if given the opportunity. People who have high pride in the work that they do, 2 out of 3 times, they'll strongly agree with that statement, compared to 22% who have moderate pride and 15% who have low work pride. Coming to work every day. One question people used to ask me is there anybody who looks forward to coming to work every day? Well, 46% of the people, almost half the people who have high pride in the work they perform, strongly agree that they look forward to coming to work every day. And compare that to people who have moderate or low work pride, less than 10%. Discretionary effort is one that people always are interested in, because discretionary effort is associated with work productivity. But 41% of people with high pride in their work say that they put in significantly more effort than the other people with whom they work. And people who have high pride, 59%, 6 out of 10, will say that they consistently go the extra mile to help their company and coworkers. So again, compare that to people who have moderate or low work pride, and you can see the important impact of having high pride in the work that you perform on these other engagement outcomes. Now, one of the things we ask people on an open-ended basis, we simply ask the question, tell us about a time when you felt really proud of the work that you performed. And out of 1,000 people, we got 1,000 different answers, but we were able to collapse them and combine them into a number of different key themes. And those themes are represented on this particular slide. They're also discussed in more detail in the white paper. But let me talk about some things in particular. Let me talk about a couple of these points in particular. One of the things that we see very clearly is that there has to be some direct link between what the worker performs, the work that the individual does, and the impact that that work has on not only the company's success, but also customer success. So as Michael mentioned before at the top of this presentation, the importance of the storytelling and telling stories about workers and the work they perform, and the very specific connection between the work that people do and the outcomes that the company and the customers of that work experience. So we talk about the importance of making sure that people know that they made a difference in the lives of the people whom they serve. We also talk about the importance of people being able to achieve things that other people might not have expected, or being able to innovate in such a way that it takes them above and beyond what they perhaps even thought they could do themselves. Uh, I think also making sure that people understand that the work that they perform serves a bigger purpose than just simply performing a task. There's that old story, and I imagine that the people on this webinar have heard it before, about the person who stopped by during the course of the Sistine Chapel being built, and they asked the first person, what are you doing? And the person said, well, I'm laying bricks. And they went down the line, and the third person that they asked, the second and third person said, I'm building a chapel. So seeing the bigger picture, seeing the entirety of what people do. And this is why I think, again, having a very clear sense of mission and purpose, and this ties in, of course, with company pride as well. But to tell a story, I used to work in the same building as the Sara Lee Corporation, and everybody knows the saying, everybody loves Sara Lee. But what a lot of people don't know is that at that time in the 90s, they were also part of the Haynes Corporation. They were all part of the same parent company. So the same people that made your pastries and donuts also made your socks and underwear. And every day those employees walked into work, and there was a sign over the door that said, we feed and clothe the world. Think about how much more pride is associated with that kind of a mission than we sell pastries and underwear. It's just a different framing. And when you think about the great companies and as they try to motivate the pride in their workers, everyone makes their people, the great companies make their people feel as though they're doing something really, really important. And that's what drives engagement. It's that sense of internal satisfaction beyond just simply earning a paycheck. So when we look at the impact of company pride, and this is pride in the organization for whom you work, you can see, again, same classifications, high, moderate, and low company pride, that people who have high company pride, 7 out of 10, they strongly agree that they would strongly recommend their company as a place to work to friends and family members. And we know that this is a key aspect in the attraction and recruitment of employees is employee recommendations, employee referrals, giving good reviews on glassdoor.com, right? And all the things that help companies attract employees. That high company pride, 7 out of 10 is going to result in a strong advocacy or referral for you. And again, compare that to when you only have moderate company pride. When asked the question, I'm extremely proud of the company for whom I work, the people who say they agree with that statement, but they don't strongly agree, they're in that moderate company pride category. And you can see that in that particular case, only 2 out of 10 would strongly recommend their company as a place to work. And if you're in the low pride category, almost no one is going to refer you to someone else. The next one I think is really interesting because we talked about the importance of pay fairness. And one of the questions that came in was, before the webinar was, I can't necessarily afford to pay my salaried workers more money. What can I do? Well, one of the things is people who have high pride in their company, you can look at this question, even if I were offered significantly more money, I would still want to stay at my current company. 1/3 of people who have high pride in the company strongly agree with that statement, that even if they were offered significantly more money to go somewhere else, they would stay with their current employer. Now, I will, in the name of honesty and fairness, say that that percentage has dropped quite a bit since the last time we did the study. But you can still see how that particular group of employees has a much more positive, elevated response to that question than the people in the moderate or the low company pride categories. Even moderate pride shows the vulnerability of workers to be taken away by a higher salary to go somewhere else. You can also see a question that we ask is, I'd be happy to spend the rest of my career with my present company. That doesn't mean doing the same job forever, but what that question taps into is it taps into the idea that I feel strongly and positively enough about this company that I could see myself making a career here, that I would want to stay with this company long term if the circumstances are right. When people have high pride in the company, 2 out of 3 people strongly agree with that statement, compared to only 17% with moderate pride or 3% with low company pride. So you can see that pride is a tremendous driver of loyalty. And lastly, I was mentioning the pay satisfaction question, the second one, the second line. I'm paid fairly for the value I create for my company. You can see 45% of people who work for companies that in which they have high pride will strongly agree with that statement, almost half, compared to much, much smaller, tiny percentages of people who work for companies in whom they have moderate or low pride. Now, again, one of the things I think is fair to mention in these studies, you could make the argument that paying people fairly and equitably creates strong pride, but I think it also, strong pride also results in a sense of fair and equitable pay coming from the sense of pride and connection they have with their company. Those of you who are on the webinar, you can ask yourselves the question, if you really, really like the company you work for, how much more money would someone have to pay you to leave and start over with someone else? And you can see that there's actual monetary value that's associated with high pride. So how do you build pride in workforce? You can see that, again, we ask people, in addition to asking what makes you proud of your work, we ask people to describe the qualities of a company for whom they would be proud to work for. Fair compensation of benefits was one of the things that came up, but also a lot of things like community impact, diversity and inclusion, being a good corporate citizen, having respect and concern for employees, recognizing employee contributions, giving people the opportunity to develop themselves. Of course, having strong products and services is something that results in having high pride in the company. But ownership and accountability and transparency of communication, those are 2 key factors of really being open and honest and transparent with employees, and demonstrating consistent leadership, having strong ethical standards. All of those things are things that create strong pride in employees. I think that, there's a certain cynicism, and those of you who remember the early 2000s remember that there were a lot of corporate scandals, particularly surrounding CEOs. And at that time, I did research that showed that less than 10% strongly agreed with the question, my company's actions are completely consistent with their words. And that number is better today. That's gone up a little bit, but there's still a lot of times perceptions of inconsistency. There's also sometimes a lack of transparency. And there's a feeling sometimes, and I think that this is the case in certain situations where publicly traded companies are looking to drive up shareholder value at the end of a quarter, or they're looking to sell the company, and all of a sudden people are just sort of dropped from the payroll and dropped as employees in order to improve the company's valuation. Those are the sorts of things that, while they have a short-term impact, when we talk about things in terms of environmental, social, and governmental ethics, the ESG and the stakeholder capitalism movement that we see emerging, we see that over the long haul, the companies that practice strong values and ethics are more sustainable and have greater value over the long haul, even if there's some short-term sacrifice. And that's difficult, I think, again, in some cases where shareholder returns and quarterly dividends are so important, but understanding that if we want to retain and attract people to come to work for our company, these are the building blocks of strong company pride that become so critical. So what is the current state of pride? When we compare it to 2021, we see on the bottom that company pride really hasn't changed at all. And company pride is pretty flat. If you look at these numbers in 21 and 2023, there's really been no movement. But where we have seen movement and downward movement is in individual work pride, that people are less proud today than they were in 2021. The percentage of people in the high pride category has gone from 43% down to 34%. You see a lot of people transitioning to that moderate pride category, but the slides I showed you earlier show that being in the moderate pride category or having moderate pride in your work really doesn't have the kind of impact on engagement that we're really trying to drive. So what's going on here? And I'm going to be making probably a little bit of editorial comment here. One of the things that we see is we see a generational shift in the workforce. And again, I want to be very careful because I certainly don't want to say anything disparaging about younger employees. My son is a Zoomer. He's 23 years old, and the other night he stayed till 12:30 in the morning with his boss and coworkers to get a job done. I think he puts an incredible amount of work into his, incredible amount of pride into his work, and creates a lot of value for his company. As a Gen Zer, there's a lot of millennials who are very proud of the work they do and of the contributions they make to the company. I hired a millennial a number of years ago to be my associate practice lead at JD Power, and I could not have functioned without her. She was tremendous and amazing. But as a whole, the millennials and the Gen Zers have less intrinsic pride than do the baby boomers. And what I mean by intrinsic pride is how people respond to questions like, I cannot stand to look at work that's not done properly, or there is no feeling like the feeling of a job well done. Baby boomers have, for the last two administrations of the survey, answered those questions much more positive and in a more elevated manner than have their younger counterparts. I do believe that baby boomers were probably raised by that World War II generation that instilled that sense of you don't do something unless it's done right. Don't leave a job without completing it. Creating that sort of internal sense of angst if the work is not done well. When we see this generational shift in the workforce, what we see is from 2021 to current day, we see a steep decline in the percentage of baby boomers employed in the workforce and a steep increase in Zoomers, the Gen Z group. For the first time this year, Gen Z is going to overtake the percentage of boomers in the workforce. So you have a generation retiring that carries with it a lot of intrinsic pride, and you have younger generations, who may not have had that type of influence in their values and upbringing. One thing we have to say fairly about pride, it is somewhat trait dependent, not just state dependent, in that there are certain people that we would hire as part of the hiring process who would just naturally demonstrate more values toward making sure that their work is done properly, making sure that their work is completed, taking that sense of intrinsic pride in the work they perform. Again, pride is evident in all generations, but I think the baby boomers, because of the values in which they were raised, brought more of that intrinsically into the workforce. And as we see a shift, a generational shift, and more of those people retiring and younger workers now becoming the majority members of the workforce, you're starting to see a diminishing of that intrinsic pride. Now, again, one of the other things that we believe, and the data supports this, is that pride is driven by recognition. The more we recognize people for their accomplishments, the prouder they become. Well, one of the things that we've seen that was a bit confounding, we saw this diminishing of pride, but we've seen an increase in the amount of recognition given over the last 2 years. Well, what's going on here? Well, when we look at the relationship between being proud of your work and recognition, people who strongly agree with the statement that I'm consistently recognized in ways that are meaningful to me, 2/3 of those people have high pride in their workforce. So, strong relationship between recognition and pride. Now, if I were to tell you 2 years ago that relationship was even stronger, here's what might be going on. When we look at who's being given the recognition right now, we see that younger workers are getting the lion's share of the recognition. This is a question: which of the following have you received in the past month? You can see that only 11% of Gen Zers and millennials have not received any recognition in the past month, compared to 23% of Gen Xers and 26% of boomers. Recognition is disproportionately given to younger workers. And what the data suggests to us is that instead of recognition now being a stimulant to performance, so that if I'm recognized, it's more motivating to me to perform and repeat strong work behavior in the future. Now, what the data is telling us is that recognition is becoming more of an expectation to the younger workforce. That now, if I'm not recognized, I expect to be recognized. If I'm not recognized, my engagement actually goes down. It's not stimulated as much as recognition or lack thereof is now a dissatisfier or something that's an expectation. So, what this tells us is that recognition programs and having formal ways of consistently and repeatedly recognizing performers, that it's no longer a nice to have, but now it's a corporate necessity. We have to recognize younger people or else they're going to leave us. Now, when it comes to the Gen X and the boomers, you can see that this data shows that particularly the boomers get very little recognition compared to their younger counterparts. And it's kind of a thing of like, I think people probably look at that generation and think, well, they're going to be retiring in a few years anyway. They're probably not going to be changing jobs. They're not going to be leaving us. So we really don't need to worry about them. They're settled in their careers, they're settled in their jobs. And so we don't really have to pay attention to baby boomers or give them the kind of recognition that we do Gen Z or millennials. But at the same time, what you saw is you actually saw a diminishing of pride in the baby boomer generation too, because that intrinsic pride they bring in is no longer being reinforced with recognition as it was even a few years ago. So people see the boomers as sort of on their way out, but yet the data tell us, the labor statistics tell us that there are now more boomers working past the age of 65 than at any other point in history. And a lot of that is because of the nature of the boomer generation, the fact that those boomers don't feel like they're quite ready to go out to pasture yet, the economics, the ability to retire and keep up with the current economic inflation and those sorts of things. One of the things that we see is people are working longer, but they're getting less recognition and reinforcement. So absolutely, we need to be recognizing younger workers, the Gen Zs and the millennials, but don't forget about the Gen Xers and the boomers because they're also really, really important to your company's success. So how do we stimulate pride in one's work? Again, these are all suggestions that came from employees themselves. Formally recognizing and appreciating valuable contributions by all employees, not some, but everybody. Recognizing employees that excel in providing excellent services or contribute positively to the community. So when we talk about recognition, we don't want recognition to just be general recognition. We really want it to be focused on very specific things that reinforce strong customer service or community contribution. Acknowledging, celebrating employees' unexpected or unique achievements. So somebody did something that they weren't expected to do. That's something we really need to celebrate. Supporting employees' personal growth and continuous learning. Encouraging employees to make positive contributions to the community through volunteer work or supporting social causes. So, providing those opportunities for coaching, mentoring, and teaching within the organization, and then encouraging employees to innovate and take initiative. and support their efforts to develop new products, processes, or initiatives. So making sure we reinforce the success to drive pride. Pride in one's company, again, having policies of transparent communication. Transparency and honesty, I cannot express how important this is to creating company pride. Having ethical leadership and role modeling, focusing on employee well-being initiatives, aligning company mission to a larger sense of purpose of the community and society as a whole. So why is your company's mission really important to the community and society as a whole? What bigger, greater good are you trying to create beyond just simply producing a certain product or service? I remember I used to give these employee surveys, and I'd ask people if they could articulate the mission of their company, and sometimes the response would be, "Yeah, my mission of my company is to make the company's owners more money." Now, that's really not it. That's not the answer we want to hear. That we always want to try to help our employees connect that dotted line between what they do and creating something that really creates more greater value for society as a whole and purpose as a whole. I remember when I went to work for the Gallup organization, I had been a university professor prior to working for Gallup, and just felt that teaching students was the most important work I could possibly do. And I remember going to speak with a guy named Larry Iman, who for years was the chief marketing officer at Gallup, and telling him, I don't know if I've got a big enough sense of mission by what I do here. And he really explained to me the importance of Gallup's mission of helping people being heard, helping people who otherwise would have no voice have their opinions be known through the polling studies and the research studies and the employee engagement work that they did. And he helped me frame what I did into a larger, broader purpose where I could go to work and feel like I wasn't just helping to make wealthy companies wealthier, but that I was actually going in and doing some good for people. And that's what we really need to help our employees understand. And then finally, empowering employees to take risks. So the three key takeaways that I want to leave you with today: understanding that pride is an often overlooked driver of the business, and it really is, I believe, key to driving the kind of business outcomes that companies want to achieve, like attracting and retaining employees, getting more productivity, keeping people showing up to work every day, all these sorts of things. I hope that this study has provided persuasive evidence that there's a direct connection between the amount of pride people have, and it really needs to be high pride. Moderate pride and low pride don't really achieve the objectives we want to achieve. Understanding that recognition is a critical success factor in facilitating both individual and company pride, but it's increasingly becoming an expectation, particularly among younger workers. And then finally, along with that, formal recognition processes are no longer just a nice to have, but are fast becoming a necessity. So with that, Michael, happy to engage in some dialogue and take some questions.
So firstly, on behalf of everybody on the call, today you really presented extremely eloquently the key facts and the mission and the idea. It's always a pleasure to hear you, present. And if you take this idea of the mission all the way to a individual job function, let's just say you were head of HR or you had a significant HR role and function, what's your mission? Is your mission to get people paid the most that you possibly can over the duration of your employee's career at the business? In some ways, that is a responsibility, but that's a responsibility that's potentially counterintuitive to the person that you report to, which could be executive leadership and the CEO, whose job is and objective is not to not allow people to get paid the most they can over the course of their life and career, training, development, education, so that they can increase their pay rates. It's not that they don't want that to happen, right? It's that they're operating within certain constructs around what they can do. So that then goes back to the question of, well, what should HR's mission be? And I propose to you all that your mission should be that you try and get the most job satisfaction possible, because you can't change people's job. You run a healthcare system and you have garbage collectors and security officers and administrators all the way through to nurses and all the other things. And there's nothing that you can do to change their jobs. The jobs need to be done in order for the whole system, a company, or even a society, if you happen to be working government and local council and rubbish collecting and the other things that make the whole thing work. But you can be very impactful in terms of people's sense of satisfaction for the jobs they do. And this idea of building individual pride and company pride speaks exactly to that. So I would suggest to you that some portion of the job responsibility is to actually work out how do you make people proud of what they do, that they may have better job satisfaction, and hopefully also that they have pay rates over time and you try and get them paid as much as possible and you have a diverse population. But those are more challenging and constrained things. However, building pride is something you absolutely can do. So a couple of mechanical things before we try and get to the 60 questions in 3 minutes, of which Rick and I will work to send some formal written responses post this, including connecting you with Rick and myself, and happy to answer in further detail if you wanted to take longer conversations post this. But I'm sure I'll just get a couple of basic mechanics out of the way so that we can put them aside, try use a few minutes together. Yes, we will distribute a copy of the presentation post this, and a copy of the video should you want to share this with some of your other team members, executives, or otherwise. Please feel free to access any of the other assets. You will also get a copy of the study in its raw form without the marketing presentation level of WorkProud, but the data that Rick has generated again for you to share. We will also be offering for some of the clients, attendees on today's call, the ability to do some study and analysis, surveys of the pride levels that are existing in your own companies, with a view to use that as evidence, perhaps to look at some initiatives that you might consider taking forward. So I just wanted to get those out there. I want to also let you know that as a follow-up from this and a related presentation is the former CEO of Grant Thornton, which was the number 5 global accounting firm in the world. Stephen Chipman has been kind enough to come and be prepared to present on May 30th on how do you take these ideas that Rick is talking about and translate those into making a business case, and thus the necessary potential investments for HR, of course, because these things all take money and resource and effort. He'll be speaking on May 30th. I hope you guys can join us. So let's go to some of the questions and we'll see what we can do with the small amount of time that we've got left. Remote, Rick. What's the construct of the remote relative to this? Did you see any observations of differences in pride levels between remote and otherwise? And if so, can one realistically build pride in employees that you can't actually physically touch?
Yes, and that's a great question. And let me say, we first asked that a couple of years ago when we were still in the throes of the pandemic and everybody was working remotely. One of the things we identified at the time, and it's still true today, is there were no differences in pride levels between people who worked exclusively remote and people who worked exclusively on site. No difference. And we thought at the time that was pretty significant because there's a lot of belief that you have to be in the office to be part of the culture. Now, what's interesting about this particular study, we did find something that I thought really struck me as noteworthy, is that it seems that hybrid workplaces where people aren't fully remote, but they don't come to the office every day, that those employees actually have higher or more elevated pride levels than either people who work exclusively on site or work exclusively remote. So that's something I think we want to think more about and look more into. But it seemed like if there was a winner among the various situations, that hybrid seemed to actually bring the strongest levels of engagement.
So another question that came out was the type of recognition strategies that are appropriate for companies both considering generational, cultural, and even in this case, the remote and hybrid. So I want to respond to this, just in a minute or two, and see if you want to add to that, Rick. And that is, the word recognition does not give sufficient breadth of explanation of what we're talking about when we're trying to connect a activity like recognition with an emotional response on the recipient's side, and that is, I feel good about that. That, in essence, is what this is all about. Someone is communicating and conveying something, telling stories. Somebody is interpreting that story and information in a manner that produces an emotional response, either individually or related to the company, individual, pride, or company. Recognition as a broad word is not necessarily me saying just to Rick, wow, thank you very much, you did a great job. Certainly that is recognition. However, it can dimensionally grow when you think about it, whereby I want to thank the company, I want to thank the team, I want to show some appreciation, I want to acknowledge something. Even while we were on the call today, one of our team members is talking about the launch of one of our client programs, and that some of the people may not have been directly involved in the work associated with that program launch, doesn't take away from the fact that they saw the recognition activities taking place in the business and celebrate. In fact, if I celebrate Rick as me giving him the recognition or appreciation or feedback, they're all the same thing. They're creating a response in Rick on one side. They're creating a response in me on the other side by the fact that I'm acknowledging that this is an important thing. And they're creating acknowledgement by the peers around that are seeing that happen. So, what I'm trying to share with everybody is it's a bigger story than recognition, or at least the word recognition is not sufficient that people should come away and say, great, I should do a years of service recognition program. That'll build pride. I'm like, no, it's moved along a little bit, both in terms of capability and otherwise. But look, we're at the end of the hour, and I don't want to take anybody's time.
Michael, may I make one quick comment?
Please.
The importance is, and here's another data point from the study, only 22% strongly agreed that they were consistently recognized in ways that were meaningful to them. And that last part of the question is really important, meaningful. Right. A lot of people have recognition programs that aren't meaningful. Meaningless recognition is worse than no recognition at all. So right. Meaningful recognition will depend on where you are in your career. So for younger people who may not make a lot of money, gift cards and gifts and awards are very meaningful. For older people, maybe not so much. Maybe it's more time with the family. It's more intrinsic recognition. For younger people, there's one statistic my friend Bob Nelson used to like to quote. 8% of the country, the best way to recognize them is to give them more work to do. All right. Now, who likes that? People who are young, who really are hungry to advance in the company, those people find that to be meaningful. Other people would find that as the worst possible recognition. So it really is important to understand what your people want before you recognize them.
So to the strategy question, it is an art, not a science, how to do this. However, there is a lot of science that can support the art and the emergence of that art. Anyway, I've taken it way to the end. Thank you, everybody, for attending today.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, we'll be sharing all the information, and Rick and I would be happy to interact or share some further details, answer questions on a one-on-one basis. If you have any, otherwise, we hope you enjoy the materials and hope you've gotten benefit out of today's webinar. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.